In this Warmaster video, we shall be taking a look at the Dwarf army. The Dwarfs are one of the original 6 races of Warmaster. The Dwarfs in Warmaster are inspired by the Dwarfs of Middle-earth and also from Norse mythology, and they are usually portrayed speaking with a Northern English or Scottish accent. The Dwarfs are short in stature, stout in build, and steadfast in temperament. They value wealth, age, and skill, and Dwarfs excel in the skills of mining, metalwork, and masonry. Dwarf warriors are known for being tough, fearless, and stubborn. Dwarfs in battle will favour heavy cutting or crushing weapons that suit their brawny physique, and they're also extremely well armoured. The Dwarf army is therefore a heavy infantry force, supported by marvels of engineering, such as the Gyrocopter and powerful artillery. The Dwarfs have no time for magic or other elfish pursuits, but they have a great skill at crafting runic weapons, with the dwarfish rune smiths being expert at breaking enemy spells. The Dwarfs are an honourable race, but they are renowned for holding grudges. The Dwarfs keep a meticulous history of their conflicts with other races, most notably the Greenskins, the Skaven, and the Elves, although they do have a long history of alliance with the men of the Empire. The main reason that a Dwarf army will march to war will be to right a wrong that is recorded in the Great Book of Grudges, no matter how long ago. And this means the Dwarfs may have good cause to take up arms against any other army. The Dwarfs reside in mountain holds which extend deep underground, and feature many miles of tunnels where the Dwarfs harvest the resources of the earth. A Dwarf fortress is nigh on impregnable from the outside, so their main threat comes from those races like the Skaven or the Goblins that can tunnel beneath them, and many of their conflicts take place in the dark beneath the world. The Dwarfen race is one in decline, with many of their holds now lost to natural disaster or invasion. The Dwarfen Empire once stretched the entire length of the World's Edge Mountains, allowing them to trade with the many human tribes that settled the old world. Alas, those days are long gone, and the surviving dwarf holds are often surrounded by enemies on all sides. This does not, however, stop the Dwarfs from vociferously defending their borders. On the field of battle, the Dwarf throng will feature mass ranks of very heavy infantry, supported by armoured missile infantry, deadly artillery, and flying machines. You will often find bands of dishonoured dwarfs named Slayers, who seek an honourable death in battle. They have no fear, and will easily cut down the enemy's monsters. Dwarfen infantry is rightly feared, as it is almost impossible to shift once it takes up defended positions. The Dwarf army list features 4 infantry choices, 2 artillery choices and 1 machine, and has 3 types of character. For every 1000 points you must take 2 units of Dwarf warriors. You must also take 1 general who has command 10, the highest value in the game. The other dwarf units can be added as you see fit to offer ranged support, threat projection and combat punch. Your compulsory infantry choices are Dwarf Warriors, and this stat line represents all armoured dwarf infantry. You can easily represent a more elite unit of dwarfs by adding a magic item to your warriors. For example, hammerers could be represented by a magic item increasing your attacks. Ironbreakers could have a banner which improves their armour save. And Longbeards could have a magic item which improves their hits. Dwarf Warriors have a solid heavy infantry stat line, although compared to other types of heavy infantry they have one less attack but one more point of armour. This makes them incredibly durable, and once Dwarf Warriors get into defendable positions, it's almost impossible to move them by assaulting them in melee. You can build a brigade of Dwarf Warriors and send them marching straight at the enemy, because even if they're caught in the open, their high armour and high hits allow them to shrug off enemy attacks, either from shooting or from enemy charges. The only real weakness that Dwarf Warriors have is terror, as they only have an average number of attacks, so when fighting terrifying foes they're not going to cause much damage. Handgunners are your first missile infantry choice, and you can take as many units as you wish. They have a 30 cm armour-piercing missile attack, and compared to Empire Handgunners they have one more hit and an armour save. They're quite similar to the Red Guard from the Kislev army. Dwarf Handgunners are actually a good unit, but they suffer in comparison to the other options available in the dwarf list, and this is mainly due to their lack of armour, as this makes them a much softer target than the Dwarf Warriors or Rangers. So instead of using them as frontline troops where the enemy will be able to charge them, try using handgunners as guards for your artillery, or as a backline sweeper unit to protect against enemy flyers. Rangers are your second missile infantry choice, and you are limited to 2 units per 1000 points. Rangers are more expensive than handgunners, and they have a better armour save, although their own shooting attack is not armour piercing. Rangers are tough enough to be used as frontline troops, and operate very well from dense terrain. However, it is the Rangers' special rule which makes them an auto-include in any dwarf army, for me. Rangers have the ability to pursue any type of retreating enemy, which is an invaluable asset in an army of infantry. You can send your Rangers out on the flanks of the army using the general's high command value, and this will allow you to set up your own charges against the enemy flanks. Rangers also work well if they are used to support Dwarf Warriors in combat. The Dwarf Warriors will tank the enemy attacks, and then if you're victorious in combat and your Rangers can draw a line of sight to the enemy, the Rangers get to pursue them no matter what unit type they are. Finally, the Rangers' shooting attack is very useful for causing confusion and disrupting enemy formations. Never leave home without a unit or 2. Troll Slayers are your fanatic infantry choice. They are comparable to other fanatic types of infantry found in different Warmaster armies, but being dwarfs they have 4 hits. Troll Slayers are the one unit in the army which is immune to terror, and they get bonus attacks when fighting enemy monsters, so they are an excellent choice if you know your enemy is likely to bring terror-causing monsters to the battle. Slayers are also immune to drivebacks, so can't be confused by enemy shooting. The downside to Slayers is that, like all fanatic infantry, they must charge on initiative, and in combat they must pursue and must advance. Because Slayers seek an honourable death in combat, they have a unique special rule, which means the enemy score full victory points for them if any units are alive at the end of the battle. Conversely, if all your Slayers are dead, the enemy score no victory points for them. Getting your Slayers killed off is not usually a problem as they have no armour, but beware of wily opponents who will reduce your Slayer units to a single stand, then ignore them for the rest of the battle, as this will cost you victory points. Taking a lot of Slayers in your army also means you're going to reach your breakpoint that much quicker when they get killed off. You can send your Slayers out as a forlorn hope to attract all the missile fire at the front of your army, but a better use for them might be as supporting troops for your dwarf warriors, especially if you put them on the flanks of a brigade in column, where their large number of attacks will help turn the tide against enemy flank charges. Alternatively, slayers make very good artillery guards, especially if you keep one stand in the unit turned to face your back line, as you will then be able to charge enemy flyers wherever they land. And because most flyer units are monsters, dwarf slayers will make very short work of them. Finally, slayers are a good choice to give a magic sword if you have a few points left over, as when they're killed off, the enemy won't score any points for the value of the sword. Slayers are a colourful, characterful and thematic choice for any dwarf army. The dwarf cannon is the best artillery in the game. It is comparable to the Empire cannon, although it actually has an armour save. The cannon gives the dwarf army some much needed force projection across the battlefield, making the enemy have to close with you. This means you're going to have to protect your cannon, either with infantry or with a flame cannon. You can use friendly infantry units to blinker the cannon and ensure they fire upon viable targets, and a brigade of 2 units of cannon can be relied upon to remove an entire stand from any unit in the game. This makes them an auto-include for me. The flame cannon is your point defence artillery piece. It is very effective in this role, as although it only has a 30 cm range, it has the potential to inflict the most number of hits of any artillery in the game. The mere potential of the amount of damage it can cause is often enough to deter enemy charges. The flame cannon is also a very cheap way to bolster your break point, but if the enemy have any troops that can outflank it, it can also be a liability, as it's very easily destroyed in combat. You also need to be aware that the flame cannon can misfire and destroy itself. This artillery piece is therefore a risk versus reward choice, so take them if you're feeling lucky. The Gyrocopter is your flying option. It is a single stand machine unit, and with only 3 hits and a 5-up save, it can be quite fragile. You do pay a premium to have access to this flying unit in an otherwise infantry force. But on the plus side, the Gyrocopter has the same shooting power as an entire unit of handgunners, which you can direct against almost any enemy unit on the table. This makes the Gyrocopter excellent at causing confusion amongst the enemy ranks, as enemies driven back by shooting must always move away from the closest enemy shooter. A pair of Gyrocopters positioned around an enemy brigade can therefore force several enemy units to be driven back into each other and make way repeatedly for each other throughout the same shooting phase. When you combine the firepower of 2 Gyrocopters with a unit of Thunderers, or even better, a brigade of artillery, you have a real chance of routing an enemy unit in the shooting phase. Gyrocopters can also be landed behind enemy lines to impose the -1 command penalty, and they also make good bait units for enemy fanatic infantry, as the enemy should only be able to get one standing contact with them and can't pursue them, meaning the Gyrocopter is highly likely to survive the engagement and leave the enemy fanatics stranded in the open. Although expensive, Gyrocopters give your army some much needed mobility and add to your scouting. The Dwarf General gives you Command 10 for only 155 points. This makes him the most cost-effective general in the whole game. His high command means you don't have to rely on subordinate characters to keep the army moving. Use your general to keep your combat brigades advancing towards the enemy, as although the majority of your units will only move 20 centimeters per order, you should be able to get 2 or even 3 orders off a turn with the general. So this potential 60 centimeter threat range may come as a shock to many opponents. If you are playing a small points game, say around 1,000 points, you don't need to take any other characters, as the general will order your entire army. The dwarf hero has the standard hero profile for Warmaster, with command 8 and 1 attack in combat. He is a perfectly serviceable character, but suffers due to being overshadowed by the other characters in the army. The main problem is that the hero cannot be mounted on anything, so the only real reason to take a hero over a runesmith is when your points are very tight. The runesmith is your third character choice. He has exactly the same profile as the hero, including the same command range. He costs 10 points more than a hero and gains the ability to dispel any enemy spell when the casting wizard is within 50 centimeters. This ability can be used against any number of enemy spells per turn and works on a 4+. The runesmith also allows you to take a dispel scroll, and because of these reasons the runesmith is simply the better option compared to a hero. The runesmith also has the option to be mounted on an Anvil of Doom. This character mount adds +1 to his attacks and also grants him a +1 to 1 dispel attempt per game. The Anvil also allows the runesmith a chance to make friendly units within 20 centimeters immune to terror. Now, this sounds like a fantastic idea for the dwarf army, who have no terrifying troops of their own. However, the concept is poorly implemented, as the Anvil only works 50% of the time and only takes effect in the dwarf player's own turn. This makes it completely useless when the enemy charge you in their turn with their terrifying troops. At 50 points, the Anvil is overcosted for what it brings to the game. I therefore only recommend taking it in friendly games only, or to recreate historic battles. A balanced dwarf list will feature a solid core of warriors, supported by rangers, slayers and artillery. And you do have some leeway with the amount of these units that you take, as there are no bad units in the dwarf list, and the more different types of unit you have, the more options you have. You can, of course, just go for a solid army of dwarf warriors. This has no soft targets and is a very tough nut to crack, but doesn't actually put out that much damage itself. You can also opt for a shooting list. All you need to do is castle up on a hill and wait for the enemy to come to you. The downside to this is you need to cause a lot of damage to them before they reach your lines. You can also use your missile troops aggressively by advancing towards the enemy in brigades where your missile troops and artillery are well protected by dwarf warriors. Try out a few different builds and see what works for you. Why would you choose to play dwarfs? Or maybe you find the dwarfen mindset appealing. They are a hard-working, hard-fighting and hard-drinking race. They don't suffer fools gladly, and they're not afraid to get stuck in. They employ tried and tested tactics, and they are the masters at taking and holding terrain. The dwarfs incorporate aspects of Norse, Anglo-Saxon and Celtic culture, so perhaps you find affinity with this. Dwarfen miniatures are freely available, if not from Games Workshop, then from a variety of alternative manufacturers. A dwarfen army benefits from a strong colour scheme to offset all the metallic tones. The dwarfs also represent heroic human qualities such as self-sacrifice, oath-keeping and skill at arms, so maybe this attracts you to the army. If your regular opponents play with orcs or skaven or high elves, then dwarves make natural antagonists. The obvious strength of the dwarf army is its Command 10 general, as using him you can redeploy your infantry brigades to counter enemy aggression and launch counterattacks of your own. The resilience of your dwarf warriors is also a great asset, as it will take the enemy a long time to cause damage to your units, allowing you the chance to countercharge them. Dwarf artillery is the best in the game and is a reliable source of damage output for your army. You can use your gyrocopters to counter enemy artillery, and the high volume of shooting units you may take gives you options for dealing with enemy in dense terrain. You can rely upon your infantry units to beat down all but the heaviest of enemy infantry. Only Chaos or Ogres will give you any problems. And finally, the Runesmith is an excellent support hero, and armies that rely upon their magic, such as Undead, will have a hard time defeating the Dwarfs, thanks to the Runesmith's anti-magic. The obvious weakness of the Dwarf army is that it has no access to cavalry. And in a game where cavalry is king, the dwarfs often suffer when fighting against heavy cavalry armies. A dwarf army caught out in the open by enemy cavalry will have a rough time, so you need to protect your troops by using dense terrain wherever possible and targeting the enemy hammer units with your artillery. The lack of terror in the army is also a problem, as you won't be able to reduce the amount of enemy attacks coming at you, whilst you will be negatively affected by their terror causes, so taking slayers helps to mitigate against this. Dwarfs are expensive, and your army is unlikely to have a double figures breakpoint at 2,000 points. A clever enemy will therefore go after your soft targets, such as missile infantry and artillery, to bring you ever closer to break. Your lack of mobility means you will often be receiving charges instead of making them. So factor this into your deployment and keep your troops within initiative range of each other. Your lack of magic means you can't buff the effectiveness of your own troops or reduce the enemy's effectiveness. And the dwarf's playstyle naturally favours a board with lots of dense terrain, so if you're forced to fight your games on a bowling green, you will suffer. What tactics work well against the dwarfs? Well, in a word, cavalry. If you can field units of heavy cavalry, or chariots, or monster units, use these to attack the dwarfs whilst they're in the open, as they have the punch that is required to get through the large amount of hits and heavy armour save of the dwarfs. Don't try and engage dwarfs on their home turf, so if they castle up on a hill or take refuge in woods, use alternative tactics to get them out. Armour-piercing artillery and spells work wonders against dwarf formations, and if you can combine a lot of shooting against dwarf units, you can often rout them without needing to cause enough hits to kill off the unit. Use mobile troops to block off dwarfs' lines of retreat from combats. That way, when you win a combat, the dwarfs will be pushed back into your troops and killed, without having to bypass their armour or hits. Terror-causing troops also work well against dwarfs, so always include a terror-causing character mount if you have the option. And if all else fails, just build large infantry brigades with tons of support, because dwarfs will not be able to fill a large army of their own and cannot dish out very many attacks. You can often win key combat engagements just by having more support. So in summary, the dwarfs are a solid defensive army. They're a good choice if you're learning to play the game. As with your Command 10 General, you can easily correct any deployment mistakes. The resilience of dwarf warriors means they will survive several rounds of close combat, allowing you to learn the rules for pursuits. The lack of cavalry can be frustrating, but don't be put off if you happen to lose your first few games with the dwarfs. Hopefully this video has given you some ideas on how to lead the dwarfs to victory.
I am a dwarf and a digging a hole, diggy diggy hole.